It was a moonless evening. The quiet waters and cold air made for a calm, peaceful, and clear night. Titanic's passengers and crew were looking forward to yet another unforgettable night on the floating palace. There was nothing that could have prepared them for what would take place in the next few horrifying hours. But is that true? On April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic sank due to multiple miscommunications on board and between ships. This tragic event led to a great loss of life and changes in sea communication forever. Sunday, April 14th, began like any other day on the ship. The morning began lazily for passengers who awoke to another day at sea. In Titanic's communication room, the morning began with a 9 a.m. message from the RMS Coronia. It was an ice warning, reporting iceberg and growler sightings further west. At 10:15 a.m., Titanic's captain, Captain Edward Smith, was handed this message by the communications crew. This is the first known ice warning of the day that was delivered to Captain Smith. But while the Sunday was serene for most on the ship, it was not for the team tasked with handling communications for the Titanic. In an inquiry following the events that took place on April 14th, surviving junior operator Harold Bride told the inquisitory panel that he and the senior operator, Jack Phillips, were very busy on Sunday the 14th. Previously, on Friday, April 12th, the messaging equipment started to have some complications and broke down. Bride and Phillips worked together through the night and got it working again by Saturday morning. However, this breakdown created a lot of stocked up messages that had to be delivered. As a luxury White Star Liner ship, Titanic passengers were given the finest treatment. The ship was equipped with the very newest in technology, and communication was no exception. The Titanic boasted a brand new Marconi system in its communication room. If a passenger wanted to send a message to their homes or their destinations, they would simply have those messages written down and delivered to the Marconi system operating team for relaying. On April 14th, messages began piling up as passengers were eager to get word to those anxiously awaiting their arrival in New York. As the ship moved closer to North America, it was possible to send messages more quickly. On that Sunday, the ship was nearing Cape Race, a land base on the island of Newfoundland, on which there was a receiving station that awaited messages for Titanic. The job of getting those messages to the Cape Race wireless operators was left to Titanic's operating staff, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. 25-year-old Phillips began his career with the Marconi Company in 1906. Phillips was named senior operator of the Titanic. 22-year-old Harold Bride was the junior operator of the Titanic. In 1912, both were selected to operate the Marconi telegraph system on Titanic's maiden voyage, and their sole responsibility was to relay passenger messages. Mid-morning on Sunday, there was a scheduled lifeboat drill at 11 a.m. Captain Smith announced the cancellation of this drill without an explanation. This decision would later be regretted. About an hour after the canceled drill, Phillips took down another ice warning from the Baltic, a ship whose location was in the direction where Titanic was headed. Upon receiving the message, Captain Smith passed it on to the ship's owner, Bruce Ismay. By 1912, most ships in the North Atlantic were in possession of a Marconi telegraph and operators. There was no question of whether Titanic would be implemented with one. Titanic's communication system could not be made possible without a man named Guglielmo Marconi. He had been the first to see the advantages of ships using wireless telegraph equipment and formed the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company in 1897. The foundation of wireless radio communication is radio waves. A transmitter can produce a radio wave, and that radio wave can then be interpreted by a receiver. This is how Titanic's operators were able to send and receive messages from other ships. Marconi's telegraph could transmit messages for 300 miles in daylight, but it doubled and sometimes tripled after dark due to long-wave radiation reflection in the ionosphere. Because of Marconi's invention, Titanic could receive messages from multiple different ships, even if it was not intended for them specifically. This is what happened at 1:45 p.m., when Titanic intercepted a message intended for another ship reporting 2 large icebergs. Despite Marconi being cutting-edge technology at the time, it was not without its inherent flaws, which had a distinct role in Titanic's fate. Many telecommunication companies were in rivalry and were sometimes even restricted from trading telegraph messages with its competitors. Channels were open to everyone at the same time. This caused many warnings to be missed on the Titanic. Perhaps the most haunting thing was that Marconi himself admitted that his telegraph was not equipped nor intended to be used as an emergency device. Throughout the day, as Titanic drew closer to Cape Race, more messages began to flood in. Many of the messages that passengers handed in were about personal updates to friends and family. Many messages contained information about the journey and letting friends know passengers missed them. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were playing catch-up throughout the day and into the afternoon hours. Each of them were furiously working during their 6-hour shifts, as well as keeping a mindful eye on things while the other was actively sending and receiving messages. The two operators worked in the span of 3 rooms. The silent room was the room used to transmit messages. This room was connected to the Marconi room through means of a wire and a key. The Marconi room was used to sit and receive messages. The last room was a shared bedroom in which they slept. As the ship continued swiftly towards Cape Race, sleep was the last thing Phillips and Bride had on their minds. Another disadvantage of the Marconi system was that sometimes urgencies of situations would not be translated. This was the case when Captain Smith decided to change Titanic's course slightly south in an attempt to avoid the iceberg at 5:50 p.m. Because the captain was not aware of how close they were to the iceberg, he did not lower the speed. Throughout the whole duration of April 14th, Titanic had received multiple ice warnings from multiple different ships. Unfortunately, because Titanic was receiving warnings and messages from ships going on different routes than it, most were ignored or seen as irrelevant. Operators handled communication with other ships and relayed passenger messages. Each ship had a unique call sign. Titanic's was MGY. There was also a widely known distress signal, CQD. However, the International Radio Convention agreed on SOS as the International Distress Signal, coming into use in 1908. As the night grew closer, an ice warning from the Baltic is posted on the bridge. At 7:25 p.m., Bride finishes his work on the passenger accounts and goes to deliver an ice warning from the Californian, reporting 3 large icebergs, but Captain Smith had already left to dine with passengers. Surviving officers would later testify that they didn't recall seeing the message. One of the last ice warnings Titanic received was from the Mesaba. However, it was not prefixed with MSG, the indicator that the message needed to be seen by the captain. Because of this, Phillips marked it as non-urgent and failed to pass it on, continuing to send passenger telegrams from the day. Because operators could only send and receive one message at a time, when someone sent a message at the same time as another operator, it would jam the communication. Phillips was jammed by Californian operator Cyril Evans's ice warning sent at 11 p.m. Evans's signals were the loudest and strongest, so when he sent the ice warning at the same time Phillips was receiving, Evans's message came in with a big bang. Phillips was very busy, so he rebuffed the message saying, "Shut up, shut up! I am busy. I'm working Cape Race."
Well, that's it for me. I'm shutting down. Night.
After jamming Phillips, all Evans hears is Phillips sending personal passenger messages at Cape Race. After waiting patiently for another response and seeing that there isn't going to be one, Evans turns off his equipment at 11:25 p.m. and goes to bed. Evans turning off his equipment essentially seals Titanic's fate. Most of Titanic's passengers have retired to their room by 11 p.m., including Captain Smith. At 11:35, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee see something ahead and ring the overhead bell 3 times to indicate something is ahead. Fleet calls the phone connected directly to the bridge and says, "Iceberg, right ahead!" First Officer Murdock orders the ship to turn hard to the left and away from the iceberg, but their efforts are moments too late. At 11:40 p.m., Titanic collides with the iceberg. After the collision, Captain Smith is informed. It is predicted that Titanic has approximately 2 hours before it sinks. Phillips and Bride get to frantically sending out distress calls, using both CQD and SOS. The Olympic officer advised Captain Smith to have his lifeboats ready. However, none of these ships would be able to make it in time. The Californian, closest to the Titanic, was unable to receive their calls for help. Phillips dies a hero, continuing to send out distress signals until the ship's power comes to an end. At 2:30 a.m. on April 15th, Titanic disappears into the dark Atlantic waters. Carpathia arrives at 3:30 a.m., collecting as many bodies and survivors as it can find. At 8:50 a.m., 705 survivors head for New York with haunting thoughts. Soon after the disaster, the International Radiographic Conference in London passed new regulations for wireless communication on board. This included first-class passenger ships being required to have a 24-hour radio watch and maintain regular radio silence intervals to listen for distress signals. The Radio Act of 1912 restricted amateur use of long-wave frequencies. Today, ships have a clear channel for communication, and communication between ships happens on separate channels, leaving the emergency channel free. The Titanic not only made sea travel safer for future generations, but taught us all one thing: never take communication for granted.